Good. Now, just coming off the holiday season, hopefully you had time to spend with family and friends. Usually we get together with a ton of different family. You might have been meeting with just your immediate family or extended family or possibly in-laws. But family is one of those amazing words that triggers a variety of memories and responses. I don't know what your family makeup is, what your upbringing was, but each one of us has a family and therefore a story. Now, because I don't know your family's narrative like you do, I don't know what that word is triggering in you. But family can be one of the greatest sources of joy and encouragement and support. They can also be one of the greatest sources of sorrow and discouragement and negativity. Why? Why can family have such polarizing impact on us, either positively or negatively? Well, they're the ones who know you most. You have history with them. They know what fills your tank in meaningful ways. They also know how to wound, criticize, shatter your dreams, and just make you feel miserable, unlike any other. Family has the ability to do that. Good, bad, ugly, all across the board. And so family is a mixed bag of blessing and brokenness. And we all have that mixed bag. And then we gather as a family of families, and that shapes how we do life and ministry together, how we navigate this journey together. Well, this morning we'll be introduced to some of Jesus' family. In particular, his brothers and quite possibly his sisters. Among family units, then, there's nothing quite like siblings to be able to pick and poke and provoke one another. Siblings just have a unique ability that, not that parents don't, but parents don't do that. They don't treat their kids the way brothers and sisters treat their siblings. They just don't do it. So siblings just know how to push the right buttons. They know when to push, they know how far to push, and sometimes they don't draw a line, and they just keep pushing. And so we only get peeks into Jesus' family unit. Every once in a while we get a glimpse into some things. This is one of those peeks behind the curtain that we get. So I want us to realize, to understand, and to remember that Jesus' family unit and structure is really no different than what we've experienced. Now, if you just happen to be one of Jesus' siblings, imagine living with your oldest brother who never does anything wrong. He's the golden boy. I mean, there is a difference, but it's always in their face. And so we get a little peek behind the curtain with Jesus' family here this morning. And I want us to get our bearings a little bit as we're moving from chapter 6 into chapter 7. What is the author doing? He's moving us from feast day to feast day. So he's moving us from Passover to the Feast of Booths. And so remember in chapter 6, coming off of the miraculous feeding of the 5,000, we'll say 5,000 plus, Jesus walking on water, him teaching, he's doing all these miraculous signs, and he gives the first of his 7 metaphorical I am statements, teaching that he is the bread of life. So all this takes place during the season of Passover. And so we learn that in chapter 6, verse 4. All of chapter 6 is in the season of Passover. That's March, April. And now we move into the season of the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. That's September, October. This is the last of the 3 major feasts in which all the males of Jerusalem were expected to show up. They needed to attend. They had to be present in Jerusalem. And so it's been several months since Jesus' intense teaching on being the bread of life, and he pushed that imagery past the breaking point for many, right? They could only take in so much literally, and at one point, many of the disciples walked away. People were just ticked at Jesus. And so what's he been doing during this gap time? From the Feast of Passover until now, the Feast of Booths, what's been happening? It's really easy for us to be reading through John's Gospel, and we naturally move from chapter 6 to chapter 7. But several months have passed. Where's Jesus? What's he doing? Well, he's in Galilee. Look at verse 1. Tells us he went about in Galilee. Why? Because the Jews are seeking to kill him, so he's avoiding Judea. And so Jesus is in Galilee, and now what's he going to do? The Feast of Booths is at hand. All the men are supposed to go and be a part of this thing. And so with this feast approaching, will Jesus stay in Galilee, or will he go up to the Feast of Booths? Well, let's see what his snarky siblings have to say. Look at verses 3 through 9. So his brothers said to him, and that could be translated brothers and sisters. So his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you're doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." And so the siblings of Jesus, remember his half-brothers, and possibly his sisters are partaking in this, they mock him like only family can do, right? Siblings have this unique ability to do this. And we have no idea how many brothers and sisters Jesus actually had. And we don't know exactly what their age demographic is at this point. But if Jesus is in his early 30s, I'm imagining his siblings in their 20s, possibly late teens. And so there's nothing like family to be dream squashers and put-her-downers. And regardless of whether I'm right or wrong on the age demographic, I think I'm pretty accurate. But if it is this group that's in their 20s, there's nothing like this group to be really cagey in their beliefs at this point, because they have all the answers, and they can be really slick when it comes to their sarcasm, their insults, and their dogma. And so Jesus' siblings are pushing back at him. And so this exchange between Jesus and his siblings are cutting to Jesus' mission and his ministry. And verse 5 tells us why they're responding this way. It's because they don't believe in Jesus. And so they tell Jesus, stop hiding, start campaigning, hit the trail, go be present with your supporters. If you are who you claim to be, and you have to be with your followers. You have to be rallying this group to themselves. Now, you got to remember contextually, a lot of followers just left Jesus because of his teaching. It was too much for them. And so now his brothers are jumping on this bandwagon and say, stop hiding in Galilee. Go up to the feast. Go up to the Feast of Booths. Put on a show. So how does Jesus respond to his siblings' taunts? Look at verses 6 and 7. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify about it that its works are evil." The world can't hate you because you're part of it. And so Jesus responds to the mockery, the criticism of his siblings by flipping the script on them. And he does it subtly. He doesn't return in kind. But if they had ears to hear and eyes to see, he's actually calling them out for their unbelief. He says that the world hates him because he's exposing their works. He's exposing their unbelief. This goes back to John chapter 3, verses 16 through 21. And he's calling his siblings out at this point. And he's identifying them with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world hates him. He says the world can't hate you because you belong to it. You're not calling them out. You're not any different. And so instead of giving in to their taunts, Jesus encourages them to actually go up to the feast, go without him. So it's not the right time for Jesus to go up publicly, and so his brothers leave, his family leaves, and Jesus stays back in Galilee. Jesus made it very clear that his mission is not going to be derailed. The religious leaders have tried to do that, and Jesus stays on point. But family is also not going to derail his mission or ministry. So his siblings are not going to be able to get him to do something that's outside of his own nature and character or outside of the mission of God. And so now we move up to the feast. And so after his brothers and sisters, his family have gone up to the feast, Jesus decides to go up privately on his own terms. He intentionally goes in stealth mode. He knows that the religious leaders are looking for him, and he's not going to be pressured by his family to go up and make this public appearance and work some miracles and, be visibly present. So Jesus goes, and no doubt he knows the religious leaders. He knows Jerusalem. They're going to be watching the main gates, and I'm assuming he avoided the spots where they would have guards and spies and people looking. So Jesus hangs back, and he stays in the shadows. But verse 11 tells us that the Jews, and normally this is a reference to the religious leaders and quite pointedly the Pharisees, they're looking for him. They want to see him. They're aggressively searching for Jesus at the feast. Where is he? He's not going to miss this feast. It's one of the three major feasts. So where is this guy? Guys, keep your eyes open. If anyone sees him, report back to us. And when we finally catch him, then it's all going to be going on. And so the Pharisees are looking for him, and Jesus is there in stealth mode. But that's not the only thing that's going on amidst this city. And you got to remember, just like in Passover and during these major feasts, the city swells. There's people everywhere. And so word about Jesus is spreading rapidly. Remember, they're hearing about, they're witnessing firsthand, and word is spreading. They don't have the social media apps that we do today, and yet word spreads like wildfire. Jesus is working miracles. He's feeding the masses. He's teaching. He's doing all these things, and it leaves people questioning and wondering, could this be the Messiah? And so the text says in verse 12 that there was much muttering about him among the people. Well, this word muttering can mean to murmur, to grumble, to mutter, or to say things in low or hushed tones. And we know what it's like when we have to whisper about something or someone because we don't want it to be overheard, and so we're very careful and cautious. But Jesus was the talk of the city. And the court of public opinion has limited facts. And yet, even when they have limited facts, they're quick to rush into formulating opinions, and they rush to judgment. We do this all the time. And so some were saying that Jesus appears to be a good man. And others were saying just the opposite. Nope, he's leading the people astray. And so you have these conversations going on. And these conversations were happening all around the city. So the discussion was most likely taking place at every dinner table, in every diner, in every conversation. So as this festival, this feast, this very joyous time of celebration was taking place, hushed tones and muffled voices were speculating all over, through the streets, in the market, wherever people were. Who were they talking about? What were they talking about? It was Jesus. Will he show up? What's going on? And all of this gossip spread under the critical eye of the Pharisees. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, were on high alert. They had their ear to the ground. They had the pulse of the people. They knew what was going on, and they were just listening, eavesdropping, waiting to hear where's the information that we can actually learn and go and get Jesus and arrest him. So they're listening to all of this, but everyone's very cautious as they're discussing this hot topic of who Jesus is. So in their conversations, they wanted to be very careful because they didn't want to be interrogated by the religious leaders. And so as this is going on, everyone's kind of wondering, who is Jesus? Where is Jesus? Will he show up? And so now we get to midway through the feast. We'll call this the halftime show. Jesus enters the temple and he begins teaching publicly. So what he wasn't going to do, being provoked by his siblings, he now shows up, and halfway through the feast, he begins teaching publicly in the temple. Now we got to remember, when we think temple, we think, as we come to church and we're all gathered in this place in the sanctuary kind of thing, you got to remember Temple Mount. And so this massive area, think both sides of our parking lot. You've got the temple proper, which would probably be about the size of this stage inside. That's not where Jesus was teaching. He was teaching outside in the Temple Mount. There's roofed colonnades all over the place, and there's a lot of opportunity for the masses to gather. And so Jesus is teaching. And what's the response of the religious leaders? They're like, how in the world can this guy be teaching with such authority and in this manner without having any learning? He doesn't have the traditional formal education that you would expect. And so what do they say? How is this man teaching without learning when he's never studied? Interpreted literally, how does this man know his letters? How is he able to? It's like, if I'm up here speaking, you might have the same concept of me, but it's like, if I came up here without any formal education and, the church says, yeah, we want you to be our pastor, and I'm teaching, and, we're actually working through some stuff, and you're amazed because, how can this guy without any formal education do this? That's really what was going on. How can he teach like this when he's never sat under our tutelage? He's never been discipled or trained by the best rabbis. He's never gone to the best schools, or any school for that matter. He doesn't have the kind of education or degree that the religious leaders expected him to have. And so the teaching of Jesus was so captivating. It was so authoritative. It was so life-giving. It sucked people in like a tractor beam, and they were drawn in, and they were mesmerized. And his teaching was so different than that of the scribes and the Pharisees and the religious leaders. And Jesus just drew in this crowd. Crowd's awestruck. But Jesus not only knows their hearts and their thinking, or possibly overhears them having that conversation. Imagine that chatter happening as he's teaching, and he overhears it. That could have happened. But Jesus addresses their concerns in the next few verses. He explains the source of his education and his authority and his mission. Normally, rabbis would be flaunting their education. It's from this school, or they've sat under that rabbi. Now, there's more to it. It's not just a pride thing, but at the same time, it's like, whose authority are these people actually speaking on? Well, we know Rabbi so-and-so, and we know this school. And so they're representing that school or that rabbi's teaching. Who's Jesus' rabbi? Who's his instructor? Whose authority is he representing? And so Jesus shares with them just who it is, but it's so veiled to them because they will not accept what he's already told them in chapter 5, that his mission, his heart, his authority, all of that is coming from the Father. The Father's the one who sent him on mission. And so that's Jesus' rabbi or instructor or education. He comes on the authority of the Father. And they've already rejected him for this. And so as he reiterates and shares this with them in verse 16, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he'll know whether my teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. That was a big deal. But yet they refuse to hear, and they're unable to see that Jesus is connecting himself with God the Father. They reject that. And so Jesus now turns the corner in verse 19, and he exposes their inability to keep the law, a law they so desperately cherish. Look at verse 19. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Imagine hearing that from Jesus. You're on the Temple Mountain during this feast day. It's something that you cherish. It'd be like if I came up here and said, you guys think you believe the Bible, you know the Bible, you love God, you love his word, and yet none of you keeps it. You'd be a little put out by that. You'd be a little offended if I said, you know what, you only think you know the Bible. You stink. That's what they're hearing. He says, you don't have any ability to keep the law. If you truly valued this law and lived by it, you wouldn't be seeking to kill me. Because that's the very next thing. He says, you know the law of Moses, and yet you don't live by it. If you did, you wouldn't be seeking to kill me. And they're like, that's a lot to take in. That's a lot to process in that moment. But Jesus clearly touched a nerve. What happens when someone touches that nerve, that one thing that sets you off, or maybe something that's very near or dear to your heart? We get really defensive real quickly, don't we? That's what happened with this crowd. They got defensive, they push back, and they resort to a very common tactic when things get personal, when they get emotional, when they get exposed. What did they do? They pulled out inflammatory speech. They hit Jesus with an accusation or name-calling. And how do they respond to Jesus? When he says, you don't know the law, you don't live by the law, why else would you be seeking to kill me? And they said, you have a demon. Okay, they've got no other ammunition, so let's pull out inflammatory speech and call Jesus out and tell him that he's demon-possessed. Well, we're familiar with this posture. We've played this card before, okay? We respond emotionally. We respond defensively. I get that. That's how we react at times. It's not typical for us to call people demon-possessed. Sometimes you might, I don't know, maybe your kids. I don't know what the scenario is, but normally we don't call people demon-possessed. We reach for other inflammatory language and speech. We have our go-tos, but they're no less verbal punches. It just depends on the time period we're in and how slick we get with our name calling, but we call people out all the time, and that's what this crowd is doing. They're responding. They're saying, come on, Jesus. Who's seeking to kill you? You're a little paranoid here, buddy. You're out of your mind. And so then Jesus really doesn't react and respond to that. And it's one of the things, as we're going to see throughout Jesus' life and ministry, I would very much be taking things personal. It's easy for me to respond defensively and react similar to what this crowd is reacting. And Jesus can be cut down and slandered and maligned and outright lied about, and he doesn't respond. He doesn't respond the way we would expect him to respond. He doesn't take it personal. He just moves on to the thing that the crowd needs to hear. And so teachable moments with Jesus, Jesus just turns the corner and he tells the crowd, I did one work, one miracle, one sign, and you were all amazed. But you really don't know what to think about this. Some of you are amazed at the miracle, and others think I'm violating the law of Moses. So what work was Jesus referring to in verse 21? He says, I did one work, and you're all amazed, and you don't know what to think about this. Well, remember chapter 5 in verses 1 through 16, when he healed the man at the pool, the paralyzed man. It was on the Sabbath, and that was the big deal. That was the sticking point. This is the point where we learned in the story where the religious leaders moved from persecuting Jesus to planning to kill Jesus. It was that scene in chapter 5. That's what Jesus is referring to. So look at verses 22 and 23. Jesus is going to be connecting now this sign, this miracle with the law of Moses, and he does so to expose their misunderstanding of the law and their misunderstanding of the heart of God. Look at verses 22 and 23. Moses gave you circumcision. Not that it was from Moses, but from the fathers. Who's the fathers that it came through? Well, Abraham. And so Moses technically was the one who wrote all this down. And so this is the language Jesus is using. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? What's going on here? We're getting all worked up over this thing, and we really don't understand why we're getting worked up or what we're getting worked up over. And honestly, are we really much different than the crowd that Jesus was talking to? Think about what we've navigated just so far this morning. We can very easily discuss people or circumstances in hushed tones with limited information and draw our own conclusions. Well, that's what's taking place here with Jesus. We can judge people based on their education level or the kind of schooling they attend. We can resort to inflammatory speech when we feel cornered or defensive. And we can fixate on one thing that we don't like about a person or an event, and we can become very negative. And then from then on, miss anything positive that happens. So are we very different than the audience that Jesus is talking to? Well, Jesus concludes this teachable moment by telling the crowd in verse 24, what does he say? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. This is really easy to say. It is really difficult for us to do. We're quick to jump to conclusions based on little to no information. We formulate our opinions based on just a sliver of observation, limited vantage point. We do this all the time, and we do it so quickly and so naturally. Opinions then are like belly buttons. We all have them, but what use are they? What value do they serve? Well, everyone in Israel seemed to have an opinion about Jesus. How much of their muttering was anywhere near the truth? So as they're having these conversations, as they're talking with their families, as they're talking with their friends in the street, as they're at the Temple Mount, as they're hearing Jesus, and they're all drawing these conclusions, how much of their opinion was actually based in fact? They all have a limited vantage point, and yet they're filling in all the gaps and all the blanks. Now, there's a very famous and possibly familiar illustration, a Buddhist parable about the blind men and the elephant that speak to this very thing. If you pick up the manuscript, you can read it in its entirety. I won't go into it at this point, just for sake of time, but if you pick up the manuscript, you can connect some of those dots and read it on your own. But how does one actually judge with right judgment rather than by appearances? Up to this point, the audience has had a very difficult time. They haven't been able to get past the physical and literal. They've had a hard time hearing the spiritual and the actual teaching of Jesus. But there's a couple hints within the greater context. Through chapter 6, and we'll see into chapter 7 as we'll finish that out next week. But how do we actually judge with right judgment? Believing Jesus and learning to judge with right judgment, from the context, there's two factors. One is the Father's drawing, and two is the work of the Spirit. And from this point on, we are going to be introduced to the Spirit in a number of different chapters, especially concentrated when we get into chapters 14 through 17. And so we won't dive into that a ton next week. We're going to get a little bit more pointed with Jesus' teaching on the Spirit. But listen to what was prophesied of Jesus, I think is on display in this text. We're just coming off of the Christmas season, and we did focus a little bit on Isaiah chapter 9 in the promise of this coming king. Well, Isaiah 11 speaks more thoroughly of this king who would come. And listen to the judgment, the way that he would navigate under his rule. Just a few verses in Isaiah 11, starting in verse 1. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his root shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness shall he judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and with the breath of his lips, and he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. We know that one day, that day is coming, and Jesus will sit on the throne, and he will rule and reign completely, perfectly in that posture. Well, in his first coming, he initiates all of this. And he is no less doing it then, as we anticipate he will do in that day. So even then, Jesus is not judging just by appearances and by what his eye can see, because appearance and sight can deceive us. And we're really good at jumping to conclusions quickly, and yet not Jesus. And so as we continue through this text, the confusion about Jesus continues. Amidst the fake news and the fact checkers, things just don't seem to be adding up. Who is this Jesus? The unsolved mystery of the Messiah continues. So now, amidst the muttering and the debating and the murmuring about Jesus, some were starting to ask better questions and drawing some better or more interesting conclusions. Look at verses 25 and 26. Some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, "Is not this the man whom they seek to kill? And here he is, speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities know that this is the Christ? This is the Messiah?" So here he is. He just mentioned that people are seeking to kill him, while the crowd immediately pushes back, and now others are going, wait a second, this is the guy. They're seeking to arrest him. They want to kill him, and yet he's teaching publicly, openly, and they do nothing. The religious leaders say nothing. They do nothing. They're not stopping him. They're not arresting him. So what's the question they're wrestling with now? Why aren't they doing anything? If they hate this guy, and it's pretty clear that they do, they want to stop him, why aren't they doing it? Well, maybe, just possibly, the religious leaders know or they believe that he is the Messiah. So now some of the crowd are wrestling with that reality. But amidst that wrestling, because it seems like they're verbal processors, as they're talking about this and thinking about this, verse 27 causes them to swing the pendulum the other way. Look at verse 27. But we know where this man comes from. And when the Christ appears, or when the Messiah appears, no one will know where he comes from. So, what's going on? Aren't they just judging by appearances? Working off the information that they think they know? They're drawing conclusions based on limited information? Connor's going to put a slide on the screen. And I want to know how you read that. Where'd you put the emphasis? Is the emphasis on pills? Or is the emphasis on stupid? Did you take your stupid pills today? Or did you take your stupid pills today? It matters how you read that. And this is just one phrase without context. Well, the congregation, the audience, and all of Jerusalem is really navigating through this in a way with limited information, limited facts, and it's as if they've taken their stupid pills, and Jesus is going to kind of call them out on that. What's the origin information that they knew for certain about Jesus? We've already been journeying through John's gospel, and they know, remember Nathanael's response, can anything good come out of Nazareth? They know he's from Nazareth in Galilee. That's what they know. And aren't those his brothers hiding over there in the Temple Mount? I mean, they're keeping their distance, but it's like we know who his family is. This is what we know for certain. So they had some of the facts, but they didn't have all of the facts. And they believed that the origin of the true Messiah would be unknown. And so now they're debating, because we know this Jesus and we know where he's from, this eliminates him from the runnings. He can't possibly be the Messiah. And the religious leaders are going to debate this very same thing as we get to the end of this chapter. We'll look at it next week. But Jesus does what he keeps doing, and he addresses their lack of knowledge and understanding of the facts. So what Jesus does is he reiterates his previous teaching regarding his source of authority and his mission, and he's reminding them of their ignorance about everything they think they know. That's what's happening in verse 28 and 29. So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, "You know me, and you know where I come from. But I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me." So those who don't have eyes to see and ears to hear continue to miss this or reject it. The religious leaders are seeking to arrest Jesus, and yet no one lays a hand on him. Look at verse 30. Why didn't anyone lay a hand on him? His hour had not come. Jesus is off limits. He's untouchable until his hour does come, and we're not going to see that hour coming until chapter 12. So in just a few more chapters, Jesus will turn the corner and he will say, now it's time. The hour has come. And for the next several chapters from chapter 12 through chapter 17, we're going to see him mention that several times. So this importance of this hour not coming, this is on God's timetable totally. No one can touch Jesus until it's the exact right time. So even amidst their confusion, amidst their speculation, their gossip, and their faulty information swirling through Jerusalem, what is unique about what's going on in chapter 7 is that amidst all of that, many people still believed in Jesus. Look at verse 31. And yet many of the people believed in him. Remember, isn't this why John has been writing? Is so that we will see Jesus clearly and believe in him. And so what was their thought process? Okay, if this isn't the Messiah, when the real Messiah shows up, will that guy be able to do as many works as this guy? That's hard to fathom. So they're wrestling. They don't fully know. Some are believing, yet this could be. And some are reserving judgment, going, And so the jury's out. And you can imagine, just as, family units can have some tense times around topics like religion and politics, especially during holidays. There were some tense times around the dinner table in these family units all throughout Jerusalem concerning Jesus, his identity, who he is, and why he's come. And yet, as we wrap up this study this morning, we're stopping right in the middle, pretty much, of chapter 7. We're going to finish up this study next week. So I'm going to encourage you to read the entire chapter 7 throughout this week and just be thinking through this narrative. What does John want us to believe about Jesus? What does he want us to see? What does he want us to believe? Why is this significant? Remember, that's part of the purpose statement of John's gospel. But then by way of implication, I want us to consider this text. Because the text exposes some tendencies that we have that we would rather ignore or downplay. How easily can we discuss people, circumstances, or you fill in the blank, whatever, with limited information and yet draw our own conclusions? How quickly can we create an entire narrative that's more fiction than fact? We do it so easily. There's other application points that I want us to think through, or by way of implication, because the main thrust in this study is who is Jesus. But by way of implication, if you pick up the manuscript or you grab the bulletin, you can work through some more of those points just to be thinking through some things. But I think it's really hard for us sometimes to admit that we have a limited vantage point, a limited perspective when it comes to just doing life. And that's why, one of the reasons we value doing life in community. It's why we value the local church. Doing life in community helps give us some perspective when we're judging things simply by appearances. It helps us come to a better conclusion or right judgment because we're not just in our own head having this conversation, drawing conclusions. We're bouncing these things off of people that we know and love, who also value the things that we value, who will be willing to pray with us, journey with us, and do life with us. So do you have these kinds of relationships within this fellowship that will help you take a step back, ask some better questions, reevaluate a situation, pray about it? Do you have those kinds of relationships within this fellowship? Because that's the strength of this community. It's not just showing up and punching the ticket on a Sunday. That's why we have life groups. That's why we encourage you to gather together. That's why we do some of the body life things that we do, is so that you can build relationships in intentional ways, so you have people to do life together with that's going to help us get outside of our own head and be able to see with clarity who Jesus is and how this gospel applies to us in tangible ways. And so we encourage you to find those relationships that you can give and receive constructive criticism and help and walk through the text together with. People who can speak into your kids' lives because they refuse to speak to you at times. You know, we've got those seasons of life where teenagers are like, Mom and Dad are morons, but college students are amazing. They know everything. Well, surround yourself with some really cool college students. We've got groups of them, and have them invest in your kids, because guess what? They're going to be speaking gospel truth in your kids' lives. There is value of this community that is multi-generational. and it's one of the reasons we celebrate this. And our text doesn't directly, but I think indirectly can lend to this thing and help us learn to do what Jesus is talking about, is not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. And so as we navigate this and we wrap things up next week with chapter 7, it's going to be really interesting to see, and I would encourage you to be reading through chapter 7 as you go through this week. What we're going to do now, I'm going to close in prayer and invite Stephen to come on up, and then we'll all come forward and take the elements, go back to our seat, and then we'll participate in the Lord's table together. So let me pray. Father, thank you for this opportunity to gather as your people in this place, to continue our journey through John's gospel. At this point in the narrative, Jesus, people have no idea who you are or why you came at this point. And yet we're being reminded of things that we know and believe to be true. Thank you for showing us who you are and giving us eyes to see and believe you. Help us to take this text to heart and continue to strengthen us by your Spirit through your word to be careful in how we judge, and to be judging with right judgment, filtered through your scripture, in prayer, and even the strength of the community of believers, so that we can be judging and having eyes to see through the way that you see. And so as we continue to navigate our lives, strengthen and encourage us. I pray that even now as we participate in the Lord's table, may we be reminded of your goodness to us in the giving of your Son,